Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you all for coming today. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. I'm very, very grateful to our hosts and for all of you and for the very warm and generous hospitality we've received so far. It's my first time in Morocco, but it's been a pleasure from start to this very moment. Hopefully I'll still feel that way in half an hour's time. One thing I would say is in thinking about Jefferson and rights, and there's much to be said, of course, I hadn't expected we'd spend quite so much time as we have discussing the right to beauty. Although Jefferson did not enumerate beauty as one of the rights, I think he'd be comfortable with that. Jefferson certainly appreciated aesthetic beauty, so I think he would be pleased with the conversation. I don't know what he'd have to say about free plastic surgery in Argentina, but fortunately, it's not my problem. It's great to be here. Building on the theme of the conference, I want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about how rights are realized in a post-revolutionary order in the international sphere, and how I want to look at how post-revolutionary countries, in this case, the case I want to use today is the United States, of course, in the first years after its independence, sought to pursue and achieve and realize its international rights. Because rights, as we've discussed them so far, have been individual rights. Indeed, rights are individual. But rights are guaranteed in most cases by states or in some cases transnational organizations. And how states and how the state system operates is integral to whether rights can be maintained internationally. And this is certainly something that Jefferson gave a lot of thought to. And I want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about how Jefferson thought about this question of how rights can be maintained and realized at the international level, and how a weak post-revolutionary state, that is the United States, sought to achieve its rights. This is something, as somebody who teaches American history outside of the United States, that I confront a lot. One thing that's very difficult to get over to students, and I'd be eager to impress this on you today as my remarks progress. You need to appreciate that the United States in the 18th century, when it was a post-revolutionary nation, was a weak nation. Jefferson boasted about how powerful the United States was, but that was an incipient power. That was a power in the future, really. He had faith in democracy and faith in the American people, but in the global order of the 18th century, the United States is weak. So when Jefferson's reconceptualizing rights in an international context and how rights can be realized in international relations, he's doing so in the context of a global system where the United States is not very powerful. And indeed, it's buffeted by much stronger powers, particularly the Western European imperial powers, France and Britain in particular, but more generally, it's a weak player in the international state system. So the dilemma he faces is how the United States can, if you will, protect its rights as a state and therefore the rights of its citizens in a system where the United States is a weak player. As I said, this is very difficult to get over to students in the 21st century because, of course, we live in a world where the United States is very powerful. But that wasn't always the case, to be sure. Now, I want to begin with an image, and I hope you'll indulge me in this. This is a celebratory image painted in the late 19th century depicting an incident during the so-called Barbary War. And the Barbary War, as I'm sure many of you know, was fought between the United States and Tripoli during the first years of Jefferson's first administration between 1801 and 1805. And this is an image from the Barbary War of Stephen Decatur, who was an American naval hero. Basically, the details don't really matter, except what you see here is an expression of American nationalism, not in the early 19th century. This painting was painted in 1878. It's an expression of American nationalism in the late 19th century. And one thing that's very important about the Barbary War for the United States is, especially for the United States Navy, is it's an important moment in the creation of a naval tradition for the United States. So the Barbary War has long-standing consequences for the United States, much in the way that we as historians call imagined tradition, if you will. So the heroism, as the Americans see of the Barbary War, helps establish a naval tradition for a country which is newly born. Now, the Barbary War has received a great deal of attention, perhaps unsurprisingly, since 2001. Received relatively little attention between about 1820 and 2001, when it was seen usually as a bit of a footnote in the history of Jefferson's presidency. However, in the past decade, because of the advent of what some have called the global war on terror by the United States, this early conflict between the United States and the Islamic states of North Africa was seen as a precursor to that. I think that's a complete misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of the Barbary War. And I'll say something about that. So to some extent, I'm showing you this image to say it's completely wrong. Not in terms of the battle it's depicting, the battle doesn't matter. In terms of the message it's seeking to convey and the way that message has been reinterpreted since 2001. Jefferson certainly did not see the Barbary War as a war between the United States and Islam, for example, and I'll say something about that in the end. More properly, though, I think the emphasis on the Barbary War has led us to misunderstand the idealism and the hope for to use a phrase from a later period, the hope for a new world order that Jefferson envisioned in the immediate aftermath of American independence when he was serving as a diplomat and representing the United States in Europe, particularly as Minister to France, and then subsequently, and while he was Minister to France, he carried on negotiations with what the United States knew as the Barbary states of North Africa, with some success. Marginal indeed, but some success, particularly with regard to Morocco. And this moment, and I want to focus a little bit on one particular year, 1786, is a moment of great triumph for Jefferson's vision of the way the world could be. And I want to take a few minutes and discuss that. But first, we need to consider Jefferson's conception of the world and how it should operate. And I want to emphasize rights, but I also want to emphasize international relations as a means by which rights are guaranteed and delivered. We have a quote here, and it's a quote that Tom Palmer very expertly deconstructed earlier today. In fact, I think this is the third presentation we've given you this quote, but if you're going to know one quote by Jefferson, this is the one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, that's the American Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776. Jefferson believed that rights were essential, and that rights were the prerequisite for a human society and for free society. He famously said, and in a later letter, it's not as famous as the Declaration of Independence, but in a letter he wrote in 1824, which I quote up there, he wrote, "The Creator has made the earth for the living, not the dead." And this is often cited by Jefferson scholars. But this is what I want to emphasize, the second part to this. Nothing then is unchangeable but the inherent and unalienable rights of man. Jefferson died in 1826. He died on the 4th of July, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the American Declaration of Independence. And to the end of his days, he still believed, he thought everything can change. He said, you know what, constitutions come and go. Constitutions should come and go. He argued that the Americans should draft a new constitution every generation, and he estimated that a generation should be 19 years. Thank goodness we haven't pursued that bit of advice, because the country's already ungovernable. If we tried to draft a constitution every 19 years, it would be impossible. However, while everything can change and context can change, what's constant, as he said in that letter to John Cartwright, is rights. And the rights that human beings have are unalienable. They cannot be taken away. The political system, the constitutional system, fundamentally must maintain and promote rights and human rights. And Jefferson sought, as a diplomat, I want to argue today, to create a global system that would guarantee rights. I don't think I'm giving too much away. I'm probably violating the rules of teaching by telling you the ending. He doesn't succeed entirely in achieving this, certainly not in his lifetime. However, Jefferson he believed that the American Revolution was not only a revolution for the United States. He said all men are created equal, as Tom said this morning. He's not saying all Americans are equal. He's not saying all white American males are equal. He's saying all men, and he's using men. He's using gendered language, but he's using gendered language in the language of the 18th century. I think he means humanity is equal. So therefore, as a corollary to that statement, the Americans have to pursue equality in their own republic and have to pursue rights in their own republic. He wants to create a global system that will guarantee rights. The problem is, he knows that the United States is a bit player in a global system where rights and equality are not important factors. The United States is a bit player in a global system, at least an Atlantic system, dominated by Britain and France and Spain and great powers that respect power, not rights as he sees it. He's hoping, however, to foster a new diplomacy and a new world order. If you look at the image that you see up there, it's a very odd image of Jefferson. It's one of the earliest paintings of Jefferson. It's by a man named Mather Brown. And it's the image of Jefferson that looks the least like Jefferson, if you're familiar with him. This is the one where this was done when he was in 1786, when he was at Versailles as the American minister to Paris. And the reason I call your attention to it is because it doesn't look like Jefferson, or Jefferson as we expect him to look. To our modern sensibilities, he appears to be overdressed. You can see the collar, you can see he's got the powdered hair, etc. This is Jefferson in Paris. Doesn't look anything like Nick Nolte, but this is Jefferson as, again, to our sensibilities, looking like a wannabe European aristocrat. This is a misreading of this painting, actually. One of Monticello's great historians, Gay Wilson, has done a lot of work on this painting, among other things. And Gay Wilson has demonstrated that our interpretation of this painting as Jefferson wanting to be an aristocrat is totally wrong. On the contrary, Gay argues, you need to compare Jefferson in this painting to the other diplomats at Versailles. He's not wearing a uniform. He's not wearing military medals. He's very conservatively dressed for Versailles. Yes, his hair's powdered. He has to have a powdered wig and all that. But apart from that, this is Jefferson as the Democrat. This is a diplomat as Democrat. This is the equivalent, if you will, of the 1960s radical diplomats. He's wearing the equivalent to the 18th century Nehru jacket in that picture. Or he's dressed like Che Guevara. This is not how we see him as a European dandy. We're seeing that incorrectly. And just in case we don't get it, if you look over his shoulder, you'll see liberty. It's the goddess liberty. So he wants, as a diplomat, to create a world based on liberty and rights. He writes in the Declaration of Independence that the Americans have to declare independence because, wait for it, we're talking about the United States, they have to have a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Declaring independence is not just a matter of the Americans telling the British they're independent. The Declaration of Independence only has meaning if the world, the opinions of mankind, understand it and appreciate it. And as was alluded to this morning by Tom Palmer, Morocco is one of the first countries to formally recognize American independence and accept the Declaration of Independence. So your predecessors understood you were the mankind that Jefferson and the Continental Congress was seeking to address. He believes that a new diplomacy is necessary and that a world which is governed by revolutionary republics like the United States and latterly France. He has a great deal of faith in revolutionary France, even when things turn bad. That if the world becomes a world of revolutionary republics, it will become a world of international law and order. And the rule of law, which predominates, he believes, within the American republics and the United States generally, will eventually spread throughout the world. And then a world of war, conflict, strife, predatory empires will disappear, and it'll be replaced with a world of peace. Commerce and trade is central to Jefferson's understanding of of diplomacy, and economics, I should say. Certainly his understanding of the way diplomacy and this new global diplomacy should operate was very much oriented around trade and international trade. He believed that Americans were a trading people. He believed that if the United States traded freely around the world, prosperity would ensue, so too would peace. He wrote to John Jay, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs for the United States Congress while Jefferson was in France. It's the second quote I present there. Our people are decided in the opinion that it is necessary for us to take a share in the occupation of the ocean, and their established habits induce them to require that the sea be kept open to them, and that that line of policy be pursued which will render us that element as great as possible to them. So in other words, Americans have to go to sea and trade, and they should do what they can internationally to guarantee their right to trade freely everywhere. And if they trade freely and act in a open-minded, if you will, and beneficent way in terms of their diplomacy, peace will ensue. He's worried, however. The following sentence is crucial. But what will be the consequence, he asked. Frequent wars, without doubt. He's not worried about the virtue of the Americans. He's worried about everybody else. And he's certainly worried about the British. And he's worried about France, but he's really worried about the British. It's a great pleasure to teach this material in Britain and tell the British that they're bad. It gives me great pleasure. Apologies, Andrew. He's obsessed with the British on some level. He recognizes the British are commercial rivals of the United States, and that the British are far more powerful as a maritime power than the United States, and that conflict is likely to ensue. He's hopeful, however, that commerce and reasonable diplomacy could change the world. He famously says in his first inaugural address, and this is my third quote on this slide, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, and entangling alliances with none, characterize American foreign policy. He wants the United States to trade with everyone, to carry on diplomatic relations with everyone, but to have entangling alliances with none. No alliances that are going to drag them into a war. He'll be very, very frustrated in the course of his presidency. His presidency will be bedeviled, and in some cases rewarded, by foreign policy challenges. But the kind of peace he anticipated did not come to pass. Now, if we focus on the year 1786, we see some very interesting developments. First of all, 1786 marks the completion of a commercial treaty between the United States and Morocco. It's the first treaty the United States entered into with a foreign nation after independence in 1783. So the Peace of Paris of 1783 between Britain and the United States gave the United States its freedom, gave the United States its independence, and made the United States a recognized global player. The first treaty that the United States entered into, partially at Jefferson's behest, was in 1786, and it was a commercial treaty between the United States and Morocco. And the story of this treaty is very interesting, and I know it'll be familiar to many of you, so I won't belabor it. Essentially, Jefferson, who was then Minister for the United States in Paris, and John Adams, who was the U.S. Minister in London, were empowered to conclude commercial treaties with any European powers and any extra-European powers they could find. American trade in the Mediterranean was hampered or threatened by the various North African states, Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco. And Adams and Jefferson were enjoined by Congress to try and negotiate treaties with the so-called Barbary powers. The tradition was that the great European powers like Britain had always negotiated their own treaties with the Barbary powers, usually paying substantial tribute to protect their trade and their sailors. Once the United States achieved independence, it was now subject its trade was subject to interference by the Barbary powers. Its ships were subject to capture by the Barbary powers. In 1785, the Algerians captured several American ships and imprisoned their sailors. And so there's a great deal of concern about this issue in the United States, but particularly on the part of Jefferson, because trade's so important in his way of understanding the world and the way the world works, as I attempted to show. And Jefferson is eager to complete commercial treaties with the Barbary powers, if possible. He's successful. He drafts a treaty which the American consul, the man who will become the American consul in Morocco, Thomas Berkeley, whose grave you see up here, the graves, if I can interrupt myself. Thomas Berkeley's grave is in the British cemetery in Lisbon. He was killed in a duel in 1809. Berkeley's an interesting character. Berkeley was an Irish immigrant to the United States who'd been a successful merchant. He worked as an American consul, a consul for the American government in Paris, and Jefferson identified him as a worldly man who understood business to go to Morocco in 1786 and to negotiate with the Emperor Sidi Muhammad III. And Berkeley did this, and Berkeley was successful. Berkeley and Muhammad had a very, very amicable series of talks over several days in June of 1786, and they agreed a treaty which put both nations on most favored nations status in terms of trade in just a few days. The great worry that the United States had, and certainly Jefferson had, was that normally when one completed a treaty with any of the North African states, the treaty powers had to pay tribute, had to pay substantial tribute in order to enact the treaty. Berkeley was told he couldn't pay any tribute. And Sidi Muhammad, for reasons of his own, agreed to this. And so this was the one great commercial success of Jefferson's years as a diplomat, and frankly, one of the great successes in terms of his diplomacy of his entire career. Jefferson believed the Moroccan-American Treaty of 1786 vindicated his understanding of the world and the way the world should work. That if reasonable powers got together and talked and agreed to trade, then positive relations would ensue. And the fact that the United States enjoyed harmonious relations, or has enjoyed harmonious relations with Morocco more or less ever since, vindicates, well, if Jefferson were here today, would vindicate that outlook. Unfortunately, the success of the Morocco negotiations was the exception rather than the rule when it came to Jefferson's understanding of the world and understanding of diplomacy. Conflict was more often the result. Jefferson did not enjoy success in dealing with the other Barbary states. In the spring of 1786, the very time that Berkeley was going out to negotiate in Morocco, Jefferson and John Adams were meeting the Tripolitan ambassador to London in the spring of 1786, and they carried on prolonged and lengthy negotiations in the effort to find a peaceful solution to the disputes outstanding between Tripoli and the United States. And basically, the Tripolitan ambassador said, well, it's going to cost you £300,000 at minimum to reach a deal. And the American ambassadors refused. And that set off in the summer of 1786, a very interesting discussion that you can see in the letters between Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams, as I said, was the American ambassador in London. He was a future president of the United States. He was a friend and colleague of Jefferson's, later a political rival. He's a significant figure in and of himself. Adams and Jefferson had a long correspondence after the negotiations between Tripoli and the United States broke down in the spring of 1786. And in that correspondence, they debated the best way ahead. Adams adopted a fairly pragmatic view. Adams's view was, look, trade in the Mediterranean is really, really important to us. It's extremely lucrative. We should just pay the tribute. That's what the British do. That's what the Spanish do. That's what the French do. We'll pay the tribute. We'll pay whatever it costs to have a treaty because we'll profit more in the long run through trade. Jefferson, and remember, Jefferson's often portrayed as something of a pacifist in his foreign policy. Jefferson said, no, there's a point of principle at stake here. we cannot give in. We can't be held ransom, this essentially was Jefferson's position. It would be better for us to fight in North Africa in the short term to establish this principle of free trade and open diplomacy in the long term. Adams said, yeah, that's great, but who are you going to fight with? Who's going to be by our side? Who are our allies going to be? And Adams said, look, France, Britain, Spain, they all pay. The British, in fact, were encouraging Tripoli and Algiers and Tunis to seize American ships. Jefferson said, well, we'll put together a coalition. I'm not going to use the phrase coalition of the willing. He said, we'll put together a coalition of small powers. Naples, Venice, Portugal, Sweden, Denmark. Small maritime powers whose ships are also subject to seizure in the Mediterranean. And together, we'll blockade North Africa for as long as it takes to achieve, and this is his phrase, perpetual peace. Now, he's actually, at one point, he doesn't use the phrase perpetual war for perpetual peace, but he uses those phrases in different places. He's arguing that the United States should organize an international coalition of like-minded small commercial powers who should band together to protect and promote their rights. And he uses the language of rights. He says, our right to free trade is like the right of an individual. We need to protect our rights. Nothing comes of this in the end. He goes around Versailles and he speaks to the other ambassadors from the small powers. He says, what do you think? We'll create this coalition. In fact, we can run it out of Paris because we're all here. All the diplomats who need to be here are right here. We'll create a committee. It'll be great. And they all say, that's a great idea, but we don't want to upset the French, or we don't want to upset the British. They're not going to go along with it. And so these smaller powers pass on it. They say they reject it in the end. They're sympathetic, but they don't accept it. And what we see here is the disappointment of Jefferson's international vision. He had hoped that he could put together a coalition of like-minded, smaller countries that would protect their rights together, recognizing a collective international right to security and self-defense. And this might change the international order where big powers like Britain and France bullied smaller powers, but it never came to pass. So if we think about this year, 1786, it's very interesting. On one level, we have this successful treaty negotiated between Morocco and the United States, which is an example, as Jefferson saw it, of the way the world could be, and in fact, the way the world should be. On the other hand, we have the failure of the negotiations with Tripoli and the discussion that Jefferson has with Adams about the way the world ought to be, but isn't. So if we cast our mind ahead to the first decade of the 19th century, we can see, I think, and this is the image I began with, we can see the Barbary War in a slightly different perspective. To some extent, the Barbary War represents the manifestation, the realization of that policy that Jefferson had advocated almost 20 years before. We should fight to defend our rights if necessary, and our right to trade. And the right to trade is a right, and all other rights follow on from the right to trade. On the other, we can see it as a failure because Jefferson, and more properly the United States under Jefferson's leadership, is fighting against Tripoli on its own, and it's behaving essentially like a great power. It's a weak power, but it's behaving not in a way not dissimilar to France or Britain or Spain or the other larger powers. And so the Barbary War, despite the heroic imagery and the heroic tradition that's being projected in that painting, is to some extent a failure of Jefferson's worldview. It's very different from the coalition of small powers seeking international justice that he was seeking to promote almost 2 decades before. He hasn't, however, given up entirely. I'm going to conclude by looking at Jefferson's tombstone here. See, on the right is Jefferson's gravestone in Monticello. If you haven't visited Monticello, you must if you can, and you should certainly have a look at his grave. On his gravestone, Jefferson wrote, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Now, we've already talked about this Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom today, and that's a really important achievement in Jefferson's life. The founding of the University of Virginia is the passion of his later years. He has a great deal of faith in education and the power of education to change the world for the better. But I want to talk about the first of those three things, and the Jefferson's use of language. Jefferson was always careful in his use of language. He chose his words very, very carefully. It doesn't say author of the Declaration of Independence, which is how most people speak of that founding document of the United States. He's saying author of the Declaration of American Independence. The adjective American is important there. It's not important because he's, writing that in some sort of a fusion of patriotism. Quite the contrary. He's distinguishing himself as the author of the Declaration of American Independence because he expects there are going to be a lot more. He expects the American Declaration of Independence, of which he was the primary author, is going to be the first, but there will be many to follow, and that the world will be a world of republics. And so although his understanding of the way the world worked, or the way he hoped the world would work, was tinged with a degree of regret at its apparent failure, he's hopeful even to the end of his life that it would eventually go his way. And the final quote I'll give you is from his autobiography, which Jefferson wrote in 1821, 5 years before he died. He wrote, "The appeal to the rights of man, which had been made in the U.S. and was taken up in France, first of the European nations, from her the spirit has spread over those of the South. The tyrants of the North have allied indeed against it, but it is irresistible. Their opposition will only multiply its millions of human victims. Their own satellites will catch it, and the condition of man through the civilized world will finally be greatly ameliorated." Jefferson believes, and it's interesting he uses the phrase rights of man. He's using the language of the French Revolution. He's seeing the French and American revolutions as two sides of the same coin. He said what started in America spread to France, and it's actually spread to Latin America. That's the reference to the countries of the South. The tyrants of the North, he's still worried about Britain. He said the tyrants of the North are going to have to give it up eventually. They can only delay this progress, but they can't stop it. Eventually, this is going to sweep the world. Republican government, rights, self-government, self-determination, those inalienable human rights, which he enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, will become global, he believes. That's why 5 years later, when he dies, on his tombstone, he says Declaration of American Independence, because there will be more. So we have this bittersweet legacy, if you will. Jefferson's frustrated at his inability to remake the world along the lines he'd like, or that the world will operate along the lines he'd like. But he's optimistic to the day of his death that a change is going to come. Thank you very much.